I Want You Back is a romantic comedy starring Jenny Slate and Charlie Day as recent dumpees who hatch a plan together to break each other's exes up with their new partners so they can get back together with them. There are no surprises here. Right from the beginning, you know Slate and Day are going to end up together. But the journey to get there is exactly as charming as I want it to be. They have great chemistry that matches each other, and I love it because they're not necessarily the typical rom-com leads. They have a quirkiness to them that fits the other perfectly and makes it feel more like they're real people. And there's a gentleness to this movie that leans more into the romance than the comedy. There are a few laugh-out-loud moments, but there are so many more of what I'd call smile-fondly moments. The moments of humor feel, with one or two exceptions, grounded in realistic characters without going over the top. Overall, it's a sweet movie, and it accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do. Mass is a one-room story about two couples meeting to talk about their children. One was the victim of a school shooting 6 years ago, and the other was the shooter. The film stays on these couples throughout their whole meeting. To pull off this kind of stagey story all in one room in real time, you have to have a really tight script, incredible actors, and cinematography that keeps the focus on them, and that's all absolutely the case here. We've got Jason Isaacs and Martha Plimpton as the victim's parents, and Reed Birney and Ann Dowd as the perpetrator's parents, and each one of them is such an interesting character. It feels like a play in the absolute best way, the kind of play that keeps you riveted to the edge of your seat, because the dramatic tension in the story and the characters has hooked you in, and when the time is up, you barely even realize you've just spent 2 hours watching the same scene. The script flows so naturally from one moment to the next, but still manages to hit all the essential beats and gives each character a chance to really shine in the narrative. It's kind of an incredible accomplishment. Sundown tells the story of a man vacationing in Mexico with his sister and her children. When he and his sister learn that their mother has died, they immediately make plans to return, but the man pretends he has lost his passport so he can continue on his vacation. Tim Roth plays the main character here, and he plays it so interestingly, without even an inkling as to what purpose or motivation he might have. We see him enjoying his time and lying to his sister about the difficulties of replacing his passport in a foreign country, and we can't figure out whether he's selfish or hurting or running from something or some entirely different explanation. The film spends most of its time on this part of the story and then goes in two unexpected directions at the end that I'm not convinced add much to the narrative, especially since there's such a drastic departure from the laid-back tone of the rest of the movie. So overall, despite an interesting concept and some good performances, the film doesn't quite gel for me, particularly in how it chooses to end. Turning Red is the newest Pixar movie, all about a 13-year-old girl named Mei Lin who learns that she has inherited the curse that affects the women of her family, turning into a red panda whenever her emotions heighten. She has to figure out how to navigate this new development with the help of her family and friends. When I saw the trailer for this movie, I wasn't particularly drawn to it, but I found myself falling in love with it as I watched the actual film. This is such a perfect encapsulation of a young girl starting to go through puberty, and using turning into a giant monster as a metaphor for teenagerdom seems so perfect. Mei Lin is an instantly relatable character, as are her friends, as is her mother. It's just a movie so full of recognizable characters that help to ground the story in universal emotion. This film has a lot in common with Encanto, both telling stories of girls breaking away from their family's dysfunctional patterns, and while Turning Red doesn't have as many great songs, I preferred this finale. It definitely got me teary-eyed, like Pixar's best usually do. Priz de Beaute is a French film from 1930 about a beauty pageant to select the most beautiful girl in the world. One young woman enters against the wishes of her boyfriend, and the ensuing fame it brings stretches their relationship to the breaking point. In a lot of the movies I've been watching from this year, I feel like the plot points are telegraphed well ahead of time, but I genuinely wasn't sure where this one was going to lead, which made its final scenes all the more powerful for me. And it's an interesting movie to watch in time of social media, where somehow the issue of men feeling like their women are being too publicly attractive is still a concern. It feels like a very modern story, just set in an older time. The movie moves pretty quickly, and it's an effective blend of silent and talking film technique. There's plenty of spoken dialogue, but the film also uses title cards to support transitions. I'm happy to be accessing a variety of non-English language films as part of this project, and this is one of the more interesting ones. Showtime is a 2002 buddy cop comedy starring Robert De Niro and Eddie Murphy. De Niro is the tough guy detective who's good at his job and takes nothing from nobody, while Murphy is a cop with a secret dream of breaking into show business. They end up being paired together as perfect unlikely partners for a new reality TV show about police life, and while Murphy is thrilled to get his big break, De Niro finds the whole thing demeaning. This plays out exactly how you think it will. De Niro and Murphy are both likable and surprisingly understated. Their character tropes are clear, but not played to the point of caricature. The central mystery is pretty bland, but it's really just a vehicle to get these two to work together, and the movie does a fun job of playing with the idea of reality shows, and how their attempts at authenticity are just as staged as anything scripted, and watching De Niro push back on that is pretty satisfying. Overall, it's enjoyable, if immediately forgettable. Belfast is Kenneth Branagh's semi-autobiographical film about a young boy growing up in Belfast during the Northern Ireland conflict. We see his family pressured into taking sides and trying to decide if it's worth leaving Belfast to make a better life for themselves elsewhere. I'm not surprised this is one of Branagh's more acclaimed films, because it feels the most grounded in reality to me, and therefore it's something critics love, and I don't. Toned down Branagh just doesn't have any appeal for me. It's missing the theatrical flair that makes his other work so identifiable, and instead becomes a run-of-the-mill coming-of-age movie that mildly interests me as an educational work, but not at all as an emotional one. That being said, I don't think it's a bad film. It's done well, it looks gorgeous, all the acting is spot on. It just leaves me a little cold. But I'm not surprised that it's gotten love. What I find dull about it is exactly what will draw others to it. And I'm glad the film exists, even if I have no interest in watching it again. The Worst Person in the World follows Julie, a woman who isn't sure what she wants in life or how to go after it. We watch her as she tries to find happiness at work and in her love life, including figuring out how her long-term relationship fits or doesn't fit into her life goals. This is one of those long, meandering movies where it's hard to tell if anything is actually leading to anything else. Julie is such an uncertain person that it's hard to relate to her, at least for me. She knows herself so little that I have a difficult time getting a grasp on her as well. The most interesting scenes to me are in the final third of the story, when she has some more interesting interactions with someone in her life who means more to her than she initially thought they did. It's the only indication we really get that Julie is interested in and capable of actual growth. This is the kind of movie that I feel other people probably love, but it's not really for me. Power is a Sidney Lumet film, starring Richard Gere as a political consultant working with multiple clients at varying levels. He has grown far beyond his former mentor's level of success by not insisting on having any moral conviction about his clients, and we see him struggling with whether that was the right choice or not. Lumet frequently explored the idea of corruption and power through his films, and this is another one along those lines. It's kind of a strange one to watch in 2022, as our main character ends up landing on the message that non-polished, earnest candidates are the best hope for the country, so that definitely set off a couple triggers for me, as that was exactly what people praised about our last president and said we needed, and I'm not convinced that was it. But the film definitely demonstrates how tempting it is to tamp down goals in an effort to be more palatable, and how that's hard to climb back out of once the damage is done. It's not one of Lumet's most compelling movies, but it's an interesting one to add to his many variations on a similar theme. The Tinder Swindler is a documentary following two specific women who were scammed by the same man on Tinder. He built a relationship with them, and then swindled them out of thousands of dollars before they found out and decided to take him down so he couldn't do it to anyone else. It's a simple documentary, consisting mostly of interviews with these women, supplemented with chat logs, pictures, and occasional voice messages to help paint the story. Despite its simplicity, it is interesting, because the subject is interesting, and the unresolved ending actually works really well from a narrative standpoint. It centers it as an ongoing concern for women in the dating world. Like a lot of documentaries, I struggle to evaluate it on a technical standpoint. That portion is competent, but not exciting, but it's probably worth a watch, especially if you have any interest in non-murdery true crime stories. The Parting Glass is a small, intimate story of a family traveling together to learn more about the youngest daughter's death. The crew consists of the daughter's soon-to-be ex-husband, her father, and her 4 siblings, all navigating complicated feelings about her and each other as they mourn. It's tough to write this kind of narrowly contained story, and most of the issues that pop up here are issues with the script. There's an odd sense of time here, the kind of thing you can get away with on stage, where you can pretend that someone who has been off stage for a grand total of 6 lines had time to go into the nearby store and buy multiple items, but it feels awkwardly off on a film. And for all the time spent with these characters, we hardly get to know any of them. The younger brother and the ex-husband are the only ones whose relationship with the dead woman is actually explored, making all the other characters feel like filler, characters who don't have a life off screen. If you're going to limit yourself to 6 characters, I want to feel like they've all got depth, and this falls short there. Fresh is a 2022 thriller, horror, apparently comedy about a woman whose date with a man goes south fast when she learns he wants to sell her meat to foodie cannibals on the black market. I say apparently comedy because while the premise of the story is indeed pretty wild, and there are a few moments where it goes over the top ridiculous with it, the comedy never really lands as much as the horror does. I genuinely didn't know it was billed as a comedy at all until afterward. It's a pretty fun, gross movie that taps way into the female fear of being kidnapped by their dates. Our protagonist is a smart woman, as is her best friend who comes to her rescue, and the two of them keep the movie from feeling purely like torture porn, because they're both given enough agency that we can plausibly imagine they're going to make it out. And the film does a really good job of showing the unpleasantly visceral nature of the work our villain is doing, and making it really disgusting, without actually showing all that much gore. Not an amazing movie or a groundbreaking one, but I think it hit every mark it needed to, and it was a good watch. Critical Care is a Sidney Lumet movie starring James Spader as a young resident in a hospital's critical care unit. He gets caught in the middle of an inheritance dispute between two half-sisters, where the outcome depends on the death of the father, who is in a coma and being kept alive artificially. The choice of color here is distinctive and very strange. Sequences in the hospital often appear to be happening in some sort of eerie white void, which gives them a quality that bounces between otherworldly and we couldn't afford to make our set look realistic. It definitely is deliberate though, as it occasionally changes the all-white walls to an entirely different color to convey a patient's emotional state. It doesn't always work, but it's easily the most compelling thing about this movie. While Lumet tells a lot of stories about systemic corruption, this film reminded me most of Network and Power, in which the key to taking down corrupt systems is mostly for individuals to care enough. While that lands in Network, it feels a little empty in this one, and feels a little too much like a cheesy made-for-TV movie. Framed is a 1930 melodrama about a woman whose father is killed by the police, and she determines in her heart to get revenge. Years later, she works at a casino that is frequented by the police chief's son, and she sees him as the perfect opportunity to get that revenge. Ruth, our main character, is the most interesting driving force here. There are mafia side plots going on all over the place, but those all fall to the side in light of Ruth's primary goals here. Her story is compelling, and Evelyn Brent does a marvelous job playing her and giving her lots of depth. Aside from that and her, though, the rest is just okay. There isn't a lot to point to in terms of filmmaking. It's all just told very straightforwardly and simply. It's not bad, and our main character is definitely enough to recommend it, but it's not one of the movies in my 1930 project that I'm likely to have very strong memories of when I look back at the end of it. Laughter tells the story of a young woman who married for money, but when her old fling comes back from living in Paris, the two start to rekindle their relationship. The title of this film is so appropriate, because the number one thing that stands out in this story is the playful sense of humor and chemistry that this woman has with her previous boyfriend. Every time the two of them are together, the script transforms from this serious melodrama into a smart, witty comedy, where the two are having so much fun together that it's absolutely easy to see why they are meant to be together rather than her comfort marriage. I want to credit Nancy Carroll's acting in particular for making it so easy to see the difference between the way she acts with her husband and the way she acts with her ex. It does exactly what a romance should do. It gets you to fall in love with the characters. I have not thus far been much of a fan of the romance stories I've seen in my 1930 project, but this is definitely one I'm going to remember. Falling in Love stars Meryl Streep and Robert De Niro as two strangers who meet by chance doing their holiday shopping, and then again on the train commuting to work. Despite both being married to other people, they begin an emotional affair that upends both their lives. So I have this weird thing where I don't like Meryl Streep playing normal people. Something about her acting style lends itself beautifully to characters who are a little off the beaten path, but whenever she tries to play an everyday kind of person, she still feels odd. And not in a way that adds depth to an otherwise forgettable character, but in a way that mismatches the rest of the movie. And that's definitely the case here, and De Niro doesn't bring much else to it either. There's no real sense of what these characters like about each other, other than a sort of love-at-first-sight spark. It's more interesting to watch them navigating this with their current partners than it is to watch the two of them together. Overall, a forgettable and unimpressive romance. It doesn't do either of its stars any favors, although it does have a great soundtrack from Dave Grusin. Benedetta is a Paul Verhoeven movie about a young woman who grows up at a convent in 17th century Italy. As an adult, she begins a secret affair with one of the other women in the convent, while also publicly having visions, though some of the other nuns are suspicious that she is faking all these miracles. This is apparently based on a non-fiction book, though there's not a lot of material I can find on the book, so I can't tell you how close the story is to the actual story. I can tell you, I didn't enjoy this at all. Verhoeven always rides the line between exploitation and profundity, and here I feel like it falls pretty solidly in the former camp. The erotic and religious images are combined in a way that feels less thoughtful and provocative than just flippantly salacious. There is interesting exploration to be had of how young women with culturally taboo desires may conflate holy ecstasy with carnal ecstasy, but I don't think this film handles it at all in an interesting manner. There's a story in here I'm interested in seeing, but Verhoeven obscures it, seemingly just for shock value. Once Upon a Time in America is a Sergio Leone film following a gangster looking back at various points in his life that led him to where he is now. The storytelling jumps around in a non-linear fashion as we follow our protagonist and his life of crime and the relationships he forms with people around him. This big, sprawling crime drama is basically a Western. I hadn't realized until this watch just how similar the bones of those two genres are, but I probably should have, given that I don't really care for either genre. Leone's filmmaking is always lovely, with gripping cinematography and, of course, an amazing score by Ennio Morricone, and I cared more about this movie than I do most 4-hour crime epics. That being said, this still really isn't my kind of movie. De Niro's not a likable protagonist, but also not a compellingly unlikable one, so I have trouble really caring what his relationship is like with his former gang members, or if he's ever going to get with the girl he loved his whole life. Well made and all, but this just isn't my thing. Mad Dog and Glory features Robert De Niro as a mild-mannered policeman who ends up saving the life of a ruthless mob boss played by Bill Murray. In return, Murray gifts him with Uma Thurman. De Niro doesn't want this, but is worried he'll offend Murray if he sends her away, so the two live together for a while, at first uncomfortably, and then with a growing sense of companionship. It's really fun seeing De Niro and Murray playing against type like this. If you'd given me the plot separate from the characters, I would have bet their roles were switched. And they both do a good job with it. The romance element doesn't sell me nearly as much. Thurman is stiff here, even when she's supposed to be relaxed and happy, and I just don't buy their relationship ultimately. The script is also strangely awkward, frequently feeling like it can't decide whether it's parodying cop movie tropes or playing along with them willingly, so overall it's worth it to see for the two leads' performances, but it's not a great movie outside of that. The Romantics centers around a wedding, where the entire wedding party is made up of old college friends who haven't seen each other in years. The maid of honor, played by Katie Holmes, is conflicted because the groom is her ex, who was still seeing her on the side right up until he proposed to the soon-to-be bride. The group of friends gather before the wedding to prepare, exchanging old stories and discovering how they have and haven't grown since college. This is one of those little indie films that gives some great monologues for acting classes, but don't come together quite as neatly as you'd hope. It's definitely got some good moments. Anna Paquin shines in particular as the bride. She's the picture of Southern charm with a little bit of malice and a lot of practicality hiding under the surface. I was more interested about what was going on in her head than anyone else's. The final confrontation between Paquin and Holmes is beautifully crafted and very compelling. The ending kind of falls apart, in that sort of indie film non-closure way. But if this is your kind of movie, this isn't a bad one to add to the roster, even if it's not amazing. We're No Angels is the 1980s remake of the 1950s film with the same name, this time starring Robert De Niro and Sean Penn as two prisoners who escape along with their much more violent friend and find themselves hiding out in a small town disguised as priests. It's been a long time since I saw the original, but I remember finding it really charming and delightful. For whatever reason, it doesn't work nearly as well here. So much of this hinges on the characters themselves, and there was really very little to enjoy in the humor of either our main two or the cast of side characters that they interacted with in the town. The jokes were awkward at best, and the character growth and development that you expect on at least some level in this story just doesn't land at all. All this makes me want to do is go back and watch the original and see if it holds up, or if the story as a whole has worn thin for me. Either way, this is not one to prioritize. Dressed to Kill is a Brian De Palma thriller about a serial killer and the woman who thinks she saw the killer but nobody will believe her. De Palma's style is often so fascinating to me, with his use of split screen to show the different things happening in his story at the same time, and his willingness to lean into the more campy nature of the stories he tells. Of course, sometimes that means that these stories feel more exploitational than I like, and that's definitely the case here, where there is a strong suggestion from the beginning that the killer is a trans woman. It's the kind of thing that we now mostly avoid as a trope altogether because we know it's been harmful to the trans community, and I wish that trope wasn't involved because it makes it hard to recommend or rewatch while I really enjoyed the rest of the movie. I'm particularly struck by how often De Palma has these entire scenes without dialogue, using these cheesy thought bubble images to convey what's going on in the characters' minds. It's such an interesting creative choice, and so much of this works so well, and I wish it didn't all hinge around a mentally unstable trans woman. Marry Me is a romantic comedy starring Jennifer Lopez as a music superstar making plans to marry her equally famous partner, live streamed to the world. But when she finds out at the wedding that he's been cheating on her with her assistant, she makes an impulsive decision to instead marry a fan in the crowd who was holding a sign that says "Marry Me." This fan is Owen Wilson, who was actually only there to take his daughter to the concert, but the two were married live on stage and then have to navigate their marriage as a publicity stunt that may turn into something deeper. I've often not been a huge fan of Jennifer Lopez's acting, but she's grown on me as she's gotten older, and here her charisma is miles ahead of Wilson's. In a good rom-com, the two are equally matched, but here I don't particularly want them to end up together because she's so much more interesting than he is. And that's not to say Wilson can't be charismatic, he just isn't here. The plot is a stretch and the story is silly, but all that wouldn't matter if I liked the two leads together. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work for me. Mirage is a psychological thriller starring Gregory Peck as a man who begins to have strange encounters with people he's never met who swear they know him, as well as odd resurgences of memories he's never had before. He begins to wonder if he's developed amnesia and sets out to discover the past that has been lost to him. Gregory Peck is especially good at playing this sort of smart but slightly paranoid thriller hero, and he grounds the movie when its plot loses me. Walter Matthau is also very enjoyable in his smaller role as the private investigator Peck hires to help him. Those good things being said about the actors, I was never fully satisfied at how the mystery played out and felt myself constantly second-guessing the plot decisions, but if you're here more for atmosphere than anything else, this really works. It's got a good paranoid vibe to it and does a good job of selling these terrifying moments when his whole world spins out of control. Definitely worth a watch. The Adam Project follows Ryan Reynolds on a journey to the past to save his killed partner, only he miscalculates his time travel trajectory and ends up meeting his middle school-age self instead. The two of them band together, along with their dad, played by Mark Ruffalo, to try to stop the dark future where an evil corporation uses time travel for their own ends. This is exactly the movie you think it is. It's got silly Ryan Reynolds sci-fi kids movie written all over it, and follows through in every way. It doesn't break much new ground, although I quite enjoyed seeing Catherine Keener as the villainess in the story. There are enough mild laughs and enough entertaining plot points to keep it spinning in the air. I guess I don't know how many more ways I can rephrase the sentence, "It's fun enough, but it's just fine." So, yeah, it's that. You probably already know if you'll like it or not based on the premise. It's hard to come up with much more substantial to say about it. Studio 666 is a horror comedy starring the band Foo Fighters, who set up camp in a clearly haunted house to record their newest album. They find the remnants of a short-lived older band's recordings in the basement, and then things get weird. This is one of the silliest premises for a movie I've seen in a while, but I had so much fun with it. None of the band members were great actors, but they're all willing to play along, which is all you need for something this over-the-top and campy. The various death scenes are funny and gross and ridiculous and everything I want them to be. The movie moves along at a brisk pace, so I hardly ever felt like my time was being wasted, aside from some moments of not funny banter in the first third, but fortunately that all disappeared as everyone got involved in figuring out the demon possession and the mysterious deaths. It's a thoroughly goofy movie that managed to appeal to me as a non-Foo Fighters fan, and I would hope that fans would have a similar amount of fun with it. Andrei Rublev is a film by Andrei Tarkovsky telling the story of a real-life artist who finds himself questioning his purpose as an artist during a time of war and turbulence. If you've followed any of my reviews, you'll know Tarkovsky is not a director I get along with very well. I find him irritatingly slow and maddeningly symbolic in his storytelling. This film is fairly linear and straightforward, but definitely still slow, so I found myself frequently referring back to the film's synopsis on Wikipedia to help me follow along whenever I got bored and zoned out. That actually was really helpful for me. I was able to track more easily the overall arc of the story so I could care. I still often find myself wondering why we're being shown one particular scene or another, as Tarkovsky and I just don't have the same sense of storytelling, but at least being able to follow along made it easier to remember from scene to scene, and it did help me get more out of it. Overall, an easier Tarkovsky watch for me. Licorice Pizza is Paul Thomas Anderson's latest movie, a sprawling coming-of-age story that follows a teenage child star with an entrepreneurial streak and the college-age woman he befriends. Anderson's work seldom fully resonates with me. I don't usually connect with his characters in a way that helps me see or understand their through lines, and while I may enjoy individual scenes, they never cohere the way I want them to. At best, that means I end it somewhat puzzled, and at worst it means I think, why did I even watch this? This was unfortunately more the latter for me, since I was not bored by the ending, but strongly disliked it. I feel like whatever I'd gotten out of it must have not been what Anderson intended to end it that way, and found a little bit like the whole experience had been wasted on me. I also very much feel long sprawlingness of this film, and while that's not a bad thing in and of itself, it meant for me that wasted time felt like a bigger, more frustrating loss. I know, people love Anderson and his work, he's just very seldom for me, and this one is way down my list. Metal Lords is a coming-of-age movie about two high school outcast best friends who are in a metal band together. One of them is really, really serious about the music, while the other is mostly just trying to survive high school. Things ramp up when the group decides to compete in the Battle of the Bands and have to double down to be good enough to win. One of the things I appreciated about this movie is that even when the situations they're in are a little outlandish, these kids do feel fairly realistic. Their concerns and reactions are grounded and feel like something kids might actually think and feel and worry about. I also enjoy how this movie brings its love of metal music to the foreground. Is it pretty cheesy? Maybe even to the point of feeling like it was written by an actual teenager? Sure, but it feels like it's having so much fun that I can't mind too much. It's cute and it's sweet and it does what it's supposed to do, and even though I can't imagine wanting to rewatch it anytime soon, it was a fun enough one to see once. Darkness is a horror film about a family who moves into a new house only for strange things to start happening, possibly centered around the father's unusual illness that occasionally makes him unpredictably violent. The film this reminded me most of, although it was filmed several years later, was The Orphanage. Problem is, The Orphanage is beautifully filmed and scripted and acted, and this one's kind of sloppy. There is one actually pretty cool twist in the last 15 minutes of the movie that is fun enough that it almost makes me forget how lazy the rest is, but not quite. And as much as I've enjoyed watching Anna Paquin's filmography, I don't enjoy her in thrillers. Her instincts are often to lean shrill, which is hard for me to engage with. And the story kind of meanders around in an uninteresting way that keeps the tension from ever truly climbing until the very end. If this is a genre or a cast you have special affinity for, it might still be worth a watch, but on its own, it's pretty mediocre. Sisters is a Brian De Palma movie about a woman whose one-night stand appears to be murdered by her mysterious twin sister. When a journalist across the way sees the murder victim, she sets out to see what happened, and things get real weird. The more I watch of De Palma, the more I realize how often he gels with me. Where so many 1970s films latch onto that sort of gritty, gross cinematography in a way that feels depressing, De Palma's work seems to be taking great joy in its scuzziness, leaning into the camp and ugliness with a sense of infectious glee. This story, like so many of his others, feels improbable, but is just delightful to watch play out. His use of split screen here is very effective in ramping up tension, as we're able to see how close our villain is to hiding the body as the police simultaneously approach their door. It's so effective, in fact, that I'm a little surprised we don't see it more often in horror movies. The plot of this doesn't make any sense, but I just had so much fun with the style, I have to recommend it. Everything Everywhere All at Once is a 2022 film starring Michelle Yeoh as the exhausted, hard-working owner of a laundromat who's being audited. Amid all of her stress, she discovers that the multiverse exists, and that she is somehow extremely important to it, and to stopping a mysterious evil that's jumping through the universes. So she must learn to jump through universes herself to solve the problem. This is a wild, funny, beautiful ride. The film really takes advantage of the absurdist nature of multiple universes and the infinite selection of literally anything being possible. That absurdity makes for both some of the funniest and some of the saddest moments in the whole movie. But despite the big picture gimmick idea, at the heart of it, it really does make space to be a beautiful, thoughtful, heartbreaking look at motherhood and existential crises and how to deal with loved ones who are in pain. This movie at no point was disappointing. Every step along the journey was truly a delight. Le Cercle Rouge follows a newly released prisoner who finds himself needing to take on another job even though they put him at risk of heading back to prison. I've really liked other films by this same director, but this one just didn't gel for me. Not even with Alain Delon as our protagonist. It just seems to tread so many of the same old tropes of crime movies, and I'm just tired of hearing about them. I don't know that this brought anything new to the table, although if you're only going to watch one movie focusing on these themes, this isn't a bad one. It's just not one that I was going to get much out of. The cinematography and acting and scripting are all fine. If this is your kind of movie, it's definitely worth the watch. If it's not, it doesn't step beyond those boxes. The House is an animated anthology film based apparently on a book that I have not read, featuring a creepy house with 3 different stories about it, all featuring the house having some sort of unnatural pull over the people in it, or the animals in it, as the last 2, they are not human. This is definitely a deeply creepy film. Something about the style of the animation is unsettling. The stories themselves are eerie, and none of them give a clear explanation about what's happening or why it's happening. We just know that this house is, for example, starting to eat people, but we don't know why. It's a whimsical kind of horror, which is fascinating to me. I think the second film of the 3 was my favorite, even though I had the least idea of what it meant. It hit me on such an unsettling, visceral level that I couldn't help but have a big reaction to it. And I think the reaction that I had to all 3 of these will stay with me. Definitely worth a watch, especially if you like weird animation or creepy kid stories. And I'm interested in checking out the book at some point, because I am curious as to how different that is. Drive My Car is a Japanese film about a play director whose wife dies unexpectedly, and sometime later we see him directing a production of Uncle Vanya, in which he casts his wife's ex-lover as Vanya. The title comes from the fact that the man is driven back and forth from his lodgings to his rehearsals by a young female driver who he gets to know along the way. This is a very slow, quiet film that has no interest in giving you any more information than it has to. Sometimes that really pays off. The scene, for example, where the actor and the director finally open up to each other about the wife worked for me. But sometimes, as in good chunks of the first 2/3 of the movie, it's frustrating. This is a 3-hour movie, and you have to be ready to give it that amount of time and be prepared to sink yourself into it for that amount of time. I heard this from reviewers before, but I wasn't able to get that amount of time set aside to focus on it, and as a result, while I liked the film, I think there was more to get out of it, and I do hope to revisit it sometime to dig deeper. Session 9 is a creepy, low-budget horror about an asbestos cleaning crew who are working on an old, abandoned mental institution. Along the way, we get flashes of the creepy stories of the horrors that this place once housed, as well as hints that maybe some of the former inmates are now just walking around out there. Not my favorite trope, that setting up a fear of the mentally unstable, but despite teasing that, the way that the story lands works well for me. The twist is one that you can see coming if you're paying attention, but it does make sense, and I think it's filmed and revealed in a satisfying way. And so even if you could see it coming, even if you knew what you were going to find out, the reveal is done in a chilling way. That being said, the low budget absolutely shows, and some of the dialogue is clunky, but it's a valiant effort that works on a few levels, if not all of them. The Naked Prey is a British action-adventure drama about a man who was hunting for ivory in Africa when he and his crew are attacked by a group of local natives and he has to escape and make his way back home. Let me start off with a good thing first. This film looks beautiful. It spends its time loving the animal life and the plant life and the rivers and the deserts of the country. There are moments where it feels like a National Geographic special. It spends that much time admiring and examining the outdoors. Problem is, it's also asking us to sympathize with a European colonizer coming in and hunting another country's natural resources for his own profit. I don't want to see him get away with that. This probably didn't strike audiences back in the 1960s as being a hero you couldn't root for, but that was the case here. I appreciated having long sections where we watched the native tribes discuss their plans with no subtitles, as it helped to humanize them a bit and not pose them only as the nameless enemy, but it's a story that struggles to work overall in 2022. Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers is the 2022 reboot of the Rescue Rangers franchise. In this version, Chip and Dale are real characters in a cartoon live-action hybrid world a la Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This movie is as meta as you can get. More meta than was good for it, I think. The parts of the script that worked were the ones that did not rely on prior knowledge of the Rescue Rangers or of the various Disney properties that show up in this version of the story. I can't think of one joke that was primarily a reference that I laughed at. The parts that did work were the character-centric ones. It felt a little bit like they took a regular buddy comedy script that was solid to begin with and then just grafted a Rescue Ranger skin onto it and added a couple references to flesh it out. As someone with no ties to the original Rescue Rangers, I found myself reacting the way I react to most franchise movies these days. I don't care. It wasn't bad, I just can't make myself care about any of it because nothing matters in a world of endless franchises. If you liked Rescue Rangers, maybe you'll like this one. I don't know. I don't care enough to give much of an opinion on it.